and welcome to the Paperbright Quarterly Slush Pile. Yay! We're so glad that you have chosen to fill your ears with us when you have so many other choices. Um, we're here to discuss poetry. We sometimes do fiction, but what we do is have an editorial meeting about submissions that come into the Paperbright Quarterly. So we thank all of our brave soldiers, and today is actually something we've never done before. It is part two of the Maggie Wolf experience, meaning we had such a lovely time discussing her work on our last episode, and we didn't get through it all, and we had all kinds of chaos. Um, but you don't really have to listen to these in order. There was no cliffhanger at the end. We have done cliffhangers before, but there was no cliffhanger. There is a narrative really, but sort of to these poems for sure. But you'll be fine if you listen now and back into part one, or you can pause here and go back to part one. But this is the Maggie Wolf Experience Part Two, and this person who's nattering on already is Kathleen Volkmiller. I thank you again, and I'm going to say hello, Marion Wren.
Hello, KVM. Lovely to see you and hear you and be with you and the rest of the PBQ team. I'm way out here in Abu Dhabi and delighted to be part of the Maggie Wolf experience. And I'm hoping we can get some sort of like reverb on that, like a sort of 70s rock band, so we can cue like I don't know, like fog machines, because it sounds amazing, the Maggie Wolf experience. I'm gonna bounce it over to Samantha.
Hi, everyone. My name is Samantha Nukebauer, and I am calling in from DC. And I am going to shoot it over to Lisa.
Good morning, all you lovely poetry people. This is Lisa Zirkle, and I am in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I'm glad to be here with all of you. And I will send it up to Canada and Dagny.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. I'm extra glad to be on this episode today because I missed part one of the Maggie Wolf experience and was very sorry to have to do that. And before I roll it to Davina, I'm just going to say, Sam, we have your snow.
I
Oh.
love snow.
Yeah. So, Davina.
Hello, everyone. Today I'm in a different location. I'm suffering from the effects of New York Fashion Week and will be until Sunday. But it's very nice to be here. I was here the last time for the chaos, and hopefully the waters has calmed a little bit this time around.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you never know. I always say you'll never know what'll happen. So we could actually have guests join us. We can have people get raptured. You just never know around here. But yeah, I'm really excited to dig into these poems again. And speaking of, let's get to it, shall we? We we did two last time, and we're going to start this time with Surveys, Maps, and Mothers S. Um, I am going to ask you, Dagny, if you wouldn't mind reading. I'm pretty sure you were the finder of these, and you weren't at part one. So would you
That's
like
it.
to?
That's exactly right. I'd love to. And as it
All
is
right.
a whole standalone episode so that people could feel free to listen to them independently, I'll remind people that this is a series of poems intended to be experienced together over the long term that are done as an abecedarian, but also an abecedarian that's done like a dictionary entry. So you get a term and then you get in this case, I'd say a riff against a term as opposed to a strict description, but that's kind of my take on it. So yeah, well, I'd love to start with surveys, maps, and mothers S. Sea level, the level of the ocean at any given time. It would be natural to talk about the drowning. Too easy, so I subvert the connection. Instead of saying I was a self-taught swimmer in the ocean of my mother's rage, let me say I was trained to calculate sea level, the rise and fall of oceanic history, as a scientist recording mathematical figures because data can't wreck a girl and leave her deep water stranded. Sextant, handheld instrument used to navigate by what the night sky is willing to reveal. The anger light pollution of mother clearing its fog in a daughter sky over time. Spatial information. We no longer worry about finding a safe place to sleep, going hungry, or the surprise knock at the door. The little girls taught to leave now root themselves in spatial information. Street addresses that stay the same year after year, stability tied to paychecks, relationships without fists. Strata plan, classification of individually owned lots within a parcel, the rehab handout of a small boat drifting in the open waters of active addiction. It's your responsibility to create your own anchors, the doctor said. Anchor yourself. A lesson I had already learned, but allowed drinking to erase. A lesson I would learn once more to survive. Subdivision. All of the smaller units shared between the three of us, grandmother, mother, and daughter. In our housed history, the similarities of shame, parts I downplay to avoid being like the her before me. Unit 1, my mother was proud of her sobriety, so I hate myself after even mentioning my own. Unit 3, my suicide attempts I call half-assed because they didn't work. Another way, I'm like my mother. We lack the conviction of my grandmother, the grit in her gall. Unit 13, where my grandmother exists as both woman and myth, her impact examined without judgment, the space where this unholy trinity doesn't feel like a lie or forced connection. Surveying, the field or act of determining boundaries. If my grandmother had surveyed the future country of her daughter and granddaughters, would it have stopped her? The drinking monster morphed inside her daughter. The violence of her fitful marriage escalated with the trigger pull. Her daughter stopped being a mother. It all goes back to grandmother and gun. She was determining the measurements of our land, the tragedy rivering through us.
Great reading, Dag.
Wonderful. Really
Oh, wow. Thank you so much.
Well, my gosh, what a piece to get
Right.
stuck into. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, while the group is thinking, I'll remind the slushies that you can go look at these poems at pbqmag.org, and um, the chaos resumes. Jason Schneiderman has joined us.
I have joined.
Woohoo!
I'm here.
And he was part of part one, and so he's just, helicoptered into part two, and we're glad to have you with us, Jason. And we will go on thinking.
Well, I wanted to pick up on a thread that I got to hear about from part one, but didn't get to participate in. And those lines under sea level, the first kind of mini poem or section in this, let me say I was trained to calculate sea level. And then it goes on to data can't wreck a girl. And I as I say, I think this came up in the first time around, but here it's so on the line, it's so out in the open, this idea that if you can create distance through data, through being a statistic, right? The statistic of experiencing child neglect or child abuse and familial trauma, that somehow you can live through it, right? Because data can't wreck a girl. I just, wow, love that.
It just also, Dagny, it's worth pointing out the extra length of that very first line, right? The way that sort of like plays across the page, the level of
Mm-hmm.
at any given time, it would be natural to talk about the drowning. And it's not like it talk about drowning, it's like the drowning. So you
The
get
drowning.
like just with that article, this invoking of family trauma, family loss, grief, right? Like in this matter of fact, and yet um from the side, right? The sort of like, I'm going to talk about this thing without talking about this thing gesture. Um,
Absolutely. And for
so
such a plain
powerful,
opening line,
right?
wow. And it is kind of like a line for a fishing rod or a
Yeah.
lifeline being thrown out in that sense when you think about it.
And then again, the subversion continues like it's so easy. I subvert the connection instead of saying I was a self-taught swimmer, right? You know what I mean? Like instead of this, I'm going to talk about this. Instead of that, I'm talking about the other. And then at the same time, through those subversions, you're conjuring the speaker's conjuring the trauma itself, right? Or
And
the
Yeah.
it's so subtle. Like the ocean of my mother's rage just sort of shows up. And we go back talking about the ocean.
right?
And we have this kind of clear sense of the way it's working at both the metaphorical and the literal level. And over and over again, it just kind of peeks up through, like kind of like the coping mechanisms, that the way that you live through the day gets
Mhm.
interrupted by
Mhm.
what's actually happened. But then you have to get back to your calculations. You have to get back to, your day job. You have to get back to, continuing.
I find the juxtaposition between drinking and drowning really
Mhm.
powerful throughout this section of the poem. Or is it
Mm.
all one poem? No, it's not. It's different poems all related, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
A sequence. Yeah.
sequence. Yeah. But the way that's threaded through this portion of the sequence, with it's your responsibility to create your own anchors. The rehab is a small boat.
Mhm.
Um, it's just like not overstated, but powerful.
Mhm.
I'm glad you brought that up. I'm going to use a metaphor that's like kind of dumb pop culture-y, but um, this is like an anthology series wherein if you dropped into just this poem, you'd get it. The same magic works that we talked about last time, which is this narrative told simply and beautifully at the same time. The craft of every word that she uses. Yeah. But so each one of these, I believe really could stand alone. Like if you just walked into this one, it's all there, right?
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
if you've read the series, you get a richer experience, an even deeper experience.
Mhm.
And I just really appreciate the subtlety and grace with which she's done that.
And it's also, it's an abecedarian, and so we're in the S section, but not every section has engaged the letter at the level of sound within the poem. Like always the headings of each section in the poem. But this one, the S's are just all over this poem. I mean, it's so
Yeah.
well done instead of saying as a self-taught swimmer. Like it just keeps showing up, like all of the
Yeah.
alliterative
Yeah.
I
S's
noticed that
and the
too. I
short,
noticed
yeah,
that
Yeah.
a
like
lot.
it's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sonically, it's
Yeah,
wild. Yeah.
yeah. And it comes
Yeah.
and goes. It's sort of like it has that kind of ocean wave to it. Like sometimes like there's like this tide of S's that's like rushing in, and sometimes it's sort of like gone out.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
undulating. I feel like I keep going back to that line about the data can't wreck a girl and thinking about the idea how, like, when a tragedy strikes, if the numbers are so large, right, we can't really conceptualize it. And that's why, if there is a mudslide or something, it's better to focus on a single victim and how she just seems to want that data so much, but once the mother starts invading this poem again, then the grandmother does as well. And I think that's very interesting how this poem starts with these intentions to um, to have a remove. And even in this kind of categorical uh, format or style of poetry, the personal keeps invading almost.
Mm. That's a good point, Sam. And I also just love that moment of Data Can't Wreck a Girl because it moves so far away from the soothing sounds of the S's that Jason just mentioned. And it almost made me think of, like, if you pinch yourself or something like that to detract from pain occurring elsewhere, it really kind of wallops you.
I can also see the S sounds as a kind of hissing though.
Yeah.
Especially,
Yeah.
Yeah.
if you're in I think in one of the earlier poems they talked about having to stay in houses that they didn't own and
Mhm.
having to make yourself small and quiet so you don't bother other people. If you're having an argument in that kind of space, it's a quiet hissing one.
Yeah.
You're
Absolutely. Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
not shouting, but the anger can come through even without.
Oh,
And that leads
absolutely.
me to this the spatial information stanza. There's so many S's in that, and the phrase that just knocks me out is the relationships without fists at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
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 One
Yeah.
thing
So
that oh,
go
sorry.
ahead, Davina. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. One thing that I wanted to make note of was let me take a look. It was, um, sorry, I should have looked at it before I had this thought. There was one specific section where they were talking about how they were starting to have to remember all these things, and it could have been a double-edged sword where you have to think about remembering all these numbers, these addresses, but also we take for granted like I guess the annoyance of trying to remember all these things, especially as a kid, because we're not moving around as much as people who are not in stable houses or stable financial situations. So I just kind of thought like it was something to make note of. Like, I've definitely taken that for granted, not um having the luxury to be annoyed, essentially.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Davina, I wonder, like, so I was thinking about that subdivision section,
Mhm.
and that's where, like, it's all of the smaller units shared between the three of us, grandmother, mother, and daughter, and our housed history, right? And I think that housed history kind of taps into what you're talking about, like the way we can sort of like take for granted if we're housed, right? Everything that's like precarious and uncertain, when you're having to move from place to place.
Mhm.
And the parts I downplay to avoid being like her, like the her before me. And then I was like, what? I was trying to understand the unit 1, the unit 3, and unit 13 in that section, right? And
Mhm.
I don't know if this is some bonkers numerology that I'm playing, right? But it's like unit 1 is mother, unit 3 is the speaker, right? Um, my suicide attempts I call half-assed because they didn't work. Another way I'm like my mother, right? We lack the conviction of my grandmother, the grit in her gall. And then unit 13, right, is the grandmother. And it's almost as if like it's 1 and 3, like it's just those two numbers coming together equals unit 1, unit 3, unit 13 is this sort of like portmanteau that like is actually part of the ancestral trauma argument, right? Like this all goes back to whatever that violence is, that original violence with the grandmother, right? And then it becomes like both the thing that blocks people from growing into being, like the mother, right? Like the grandmother's daughter is the speaker's mother, who is an abandoned her, like in through these addictions and through this violence or neglect, right? And it's just such an interesting way that that subdivision unit worked. And at first I didn't like it. To be honest with you, I was like, unit 1, 2, 3, I don't know what's this math, right? But then I can kind of see what's happening in a pleasurable way.
I sort of liked it because it's where so much bad stuff happens. Like you're
Yeah.
not supposed to not like your own sobriety because that's your mom's thing. That's like, or you're not supposed to call your suicide attempts half-assed because you didn't succeed. You're supposed to be happy that you didn't die. And so I felt like there was something sort of wonderfully refreshing about kind of like the honesty of like the bad impulse that sort of shows up in those little unit sections. Sorry, Jane.
Mhm. Going back to her in Subdivision, I'm going to use a little bit of Gen Z terminology, so bear with me. So one thing that people like to say when it comes to their parents and again, essentially their history or their past is their lore. So, like for example, a lot of people, whenever they talk about the things that their mothers tend to go through, because for some reason, every time we think about our moms, somehow something bad has happened. So it kind of reminded me of when it. I think the author is actually, of course, recognizing her trauma, but also recognizing the trauma that her mother or even her grandmother has gone through. So the lore continues, the lore grows, and it just continues to be passed on. Where she kind of now as is at a point where she bears a responsibility of either passing it on to someone that she loves next or stopping it and rewriting it. And like you said, Jason, like there's little things that she definitely needs to work on where she's kind of just indoctrinating her bad habits here and there. But I think that kind of shows the process in which healing is occurring. It's not going to be completely linear. It's not going to be completely, okay, I'm good. Yeah, let's move on. I'm completely healthy. It's definitely, there are some habits that are there that you kind of have to work through. And, I think it's also the issue of um, you don't want to be reminiscent of the of the person. I wouldn't say loathe. Loathe is the wrong word because loathe is a really strong. And if people do loathe their parents, hey, good on you. But I don't think that this is what the author is feeling. There's a mixture of, there's a complexity of emotions here, but there are definitely aspects that you don't want to take from, she doesn't want to take from her mother. Like from my experience, I would say like, love my parents. There are definitely things I don't want to take. For example, my mom, love her bad. She might have a little bit of a spending issue. I don't want to take that. But, it's not that I loathe my mom, 100% not. And I definitely don't loathe my dad, although he dances on my nerves. But there are just some things you don't want to take, and it's because you're so hyper fixated on those. What don't I want to be reminiscent of, or why do I don't want to be my father, or I don't want to be my mother. It's kind of like inadvertently spiraling into something different that you also still need to work on. It's a complex thing that I kind of realized in that like one section. I don't know if my tangent made any sense.
Your tangent made perfect
Oh,
sense.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
The other reading I had of this section was quite literal, and I don't know if this was meant, but the subdivision of the units being like almost like apartments,
Yeah.
and the way you can hear the arguments and conversations and other people's lives going on next to you when
Yeah.
you're living in close proximity.
Mm-hmm.
So that was another take that I had on it.
Wow, your sound is fine, slushies. We all just went into a reverie again.
Mhm.
What do you think? Is that a sign that we should vote?
Is it time?
I
I
believe
wanted
it's
to say one thing about what Davina was saying.
Sure.
It made me think of that Philip Larkin poem, "Your Parents Fuck You Up," or your mom and dad,
Yes,
and
read
how,
the verse. Yep. Yep.
right, and how in that poem it's like you inherit all their, issues plus like a little something extra of their flaws for yourself.
Mhm.
And so it's interesting in a poem that is, such a different structure and different style, that it's also in conversation, I think, with that Larkin poem.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, nice. Show notes.
All right, let's throw a
Yeah.
thumb.
Okay. Here we go. Fist up. One, two, three, vote. Surprise, surprise, it's in.
Yay.
Yeah.
Yay.
Thank you so much, Maggie. You can tell we are smitten. Um,
Mm.
so we've only got one more left. Boo-hoo. T, who'd like to do it? Come on, don't be shy.
Call and tell someone, Kathy.
I will tell you, Jason.
No!
Ah.
My strategy has backfired, but I'm actually very excited. All right. Surveys, maps, and mothers, T. Temporary road. Lessons learned as an adult. How to be gentle without armor. That moving on doesn't mean forgiveness, the way time quiets an ache. Thermocline. The middle layer of a large body of water, acting as the steep temperature gradient, rapid temperature drop, between the warm top and the cold deep. Oceans layered in three. The earth organizing itself by the eternity number. Three as an inescapable reminder. The Holy Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. The 3 days Jesus spent in the tomb before resurrection. My own Trinity. Grandmother, mother, and daughter. Three sisters without parents. The story structure driving all human lives. Beginning, middle, and eventual end. Title search. Searching after my shuttered-eyed refusal to look for years, brick walled me when I was finally ready for answers. An audience of dead relatives laughing at my spotlight-lit questioning. The search requires its own daughter database, a site to tell me if my mother is still alive and what I should do. Files on my grandmother illuminating everything between birth and bullet that would ricochet through our lives. True north. Direction of the northern rotational axis of Earth, not calculated by a compass, but rather by the imaginary line of the axis itself. The act of surviving and always finding my way back to myself. A rotational axis inside me that points north without need to navigate or explain, an unwavering knowing of myself, beyond daughter, victim, addict.
Peace. Thank you, Jason.
That's great. It's really satisfying to read. It's interesting how different
Mhm.
the sections are in their pacing and how the syntax really kind of carries you in very different ways, even though there's a consistency across the whole piece.
Yep.
And the spaciousness of it, right, Jason, as you were reading, like
Oh
just
yeah.
following you, like temporary road is a 3-line section, right? And the lessons learned as an adult, how to be gentle without armor, that moving on doesn't mean forgiveness, the way time quiets an ache is just like this Zen koan like level insight that it's already doing this work of pointing back into the Abecedarian, even though it's pointing forward. Because it's T, like we're not at Z, and I don't know because we only have this much of the poem, right, of the sequence. Like, does it go on further than this? I'm not sure, but maybe it's the illusion too of our Maggie Wolf experience coming to a close, but there feels like closure here, right? There
Mm.
feels like a kind of
That last line is
yeah,
just
Well, I think
gorgeous. These labels, to self-identify. Oh,
yeah.
I think the feeling of closure too is twofold, especially in that thermocline part, because the self-awareness of the speaker, um, for me, is interesting in this part because she is considering herself as the eventual end, but of course that is possibly a choice, rather than like continuing the cycle over and over again. And I'm very curious about if other areas in this poem are engaging with that, or not. And then also the interesting, um, you know, call out to religion and how, you know, is this speaker religious or not? I think maybe not. And how what might be filling that void is a type of, you know, mythology, because we need to fill that void.
Sam, I took the eventual end as death, like the story structure driving all human lives, that there's a beginning, middle, and eventual end. Um, but I see what you're saying too, that I think it could be both, you know, that she's telling her story and
Right.
she's coming to the eventual end of her story. Um, I really love that section, and the knowledge of what a thermocline is. I love a poem that teaches me something.
Yeah.
Um, I didn't necessarily need the parentheses definition there. I think I got it from context, but yeah, it's fascinating to me how powerful these brief stanzas are. And I think this poem works best for me when it is constrained, as
And
Marian said, with the first bit, the temporary road.
Yeah. I think that S section was the longest, piece of these, and then it was somehow extra powerful to me that this one was so short and so powerful. I I absolutely love the title search stanza and feel like that's almost what this whole poem is about, like ways to identify, like I said, like the last lines here. That title search stanza could also be its own poem. It's so rich and dense and ugh,
And
ugh.
I love how the second to last line in that stanza, everything between birth and bullet, sort of
Mm,
sonically calls back
Yeah.
to the second to last line from the S poem. It all goes back to grandmother and gun.
hmm
There was just that wonderful sense of recognition in there where I was like, I love what she's doing there.
Yeah.
And just to say too, Kathy, with that last line, the daughter, victim, addict, the first word on the line is beyond, right? Like an unwavering sense of myself beyond these three things, right? Which flings me back into the thermocline section, because again, you get these three bodies of water in one, the Trinity, right? The way she's using the threes to think about what's beyond the categories, and then simultaneously what she's like sunk in, right? What she's drowning in, which then goes back up into the earlier poems, right? It could have started that first line about the drowning, right? Echoes and resonates here too. So fascinating.
One and sort of the foundation of the Trinity within Christianity. I mean, the word that is used in Catholicism is mystery, but incomprehensibility, incoherence is also, that when she comes back at the end as her own Trinity of daughter, victim, addict, that these things can't all be in one and they are, right? That
Yeah.
these things like can't simultaneously be a single person, and yet they are a single person. And so the way that that's kind of mapped onto that idea of the threes. And I mean, even the beginning, middle, and end, and you can probably imagine that I was the student in middle school being like, that's meaningless. Like, what do you say? Like, beginning, middle, and end, that's stupid. Like, what? If page one is the beginning, page 100 is the end, and everything else, like, this doesn't tell me what you're really saying. Um, but then, like, the bullet, right? That's like, it's such an abrupt end, right? That's like, and then when you get to the title search, is that a genealogical thing? Is that like a 23andMe kind of thing where you can, like, title search? I thought it was going to be about deeds and
I
real
thought
estate.
so
But,
too, right? I thought so too.
um, anyway, but
Yeah.
just going in there and like, is that an ending? Are we sort of like reaching the point where meaning is made and we're released from the suspense and the emotional intensity? Or is this kind of a new beginning that we're entering in a new space to like re-examine what happened in the middle? And so I thought that like the way in which the invocation of the mystery of the Trinity works really nicely in terms of how these things kind of can't resolve, that we kind of keep seeing them in these new ways, that they keep kind of returning um, with new meaning and with new understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love title search having that other meaning, and it's not that easy, right? It's I need a its own daughter database, right?
Yeah.
Which there is no daughter database, right? We can't search for
Mm.
our own identity on some title search, right? I thought that was part of like kind of the, she wishes it would be that easy. Right. And that's why Marion's saying beyond daughter, victim, addict, that still doesn't encompass all of who they are. Right. And I'm thinking, Jason, to what you were just saying, this sounds so cornball. I'm trying to think of another way to say it, but like an end is never really an end. It's the beginning of a new thing. Right. So she's sort of potentially maybe coming to some resolutions of what she has, what her life experiences led her to. Right. And now what she will look forward to, move
Yeah,
forward into.
that's what I think I was trying to get at earlier, Kathy, about this idea of like the imaginariness of this being, you know, also as a Catholic, like the imaginary parts of these beliefs, perhaps, that the grandmother too could have viewed herself as the end. Like it's only in
Mhm.
her retelling that she is the end.
Yeah.
I keep thinking of KVM's theory for poems, like a good one when you just want to stay with it or go back
Mhm.
to it, right? And I was speaking with my students today about poems, and I shared some work we were doing with PBQ, and was totally quoting that notion, like, it's good when you want to spend time with it, right? And especially
Yeah.
in today's sort of ridiculousness of efficiencies and speed, right? Like it's
Absolutely. Yeah.
the light to slow it down with this.
So I want to echo what's being said with a small point that I want to pick up to see if other people feel the same way about it under True North. So it starts direction of the northern rotational axis of Earth, not calculated by a compass. And then down at the end of line 3, we get and always finding my way back to myself, a rotational axis. This is for me a really rare, for me it feels like a misstep in the poem where it's repeating a piece of heavy terminology that really doesn't need repeating, and in fact, in light of the kinds of themes and possible kind of partial resolution that this piece may have reached, it seemed like a shame to me that something like an emerging line or an unwavering line or just even just a line might be used instead of repeating rotational axis, which is kind of awkward. So what do people think about that?
Hmm.
Well, I didn't mind the repetition.
And you don't mind that, this is why I'm asking, right?
Yeah.
Because
It's so funny that she's talking about repeating and running back, and then she repeats the
sure,
word, right?
sure,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Is that too obvious?
Well, and it's funny, it's nested in all of this ack stuff, right? So no, it sounds like it sounds like a Billy Joel reference, but I don't mean it, right? Like,
Maybe you
Katie,
do.
what is it? What do you mean the ack, ack,
so
ack? What?
listen to this, right? Axis of Earth, not
Oh,
calculated,
Oh, yeah.
right? Compass, right? Rather imaginary line of the axis itself, the act of surviving and always finding my way back to myself, rotational axis. You know what I mean? I can hear the nesting in there, which is why I probably read past it,
Yeah,
frankly, right?
yeah.
mhm.
Diagonal, your close reading, I caught that because I got stuck in the sound of it.
Which I think is
And
a great observation. Like I love that too. So yeah, for me, it was just I found myself thinking, was there an opportunity to just add
yeah,
another tiny layer here by
no,
rewording that? But
I think you're right,
yeah,
but I think that questioning is making me see too that like in that cascade, it daughter victim addict too. Like addict kicks back to Axis, right? Like there's
Yeah.
the sound, the sonic work is surprising and total. It's almost like I'm going to mix my what is that called when you mix your senses? Synesthesia. It's almost like a stained glass
Yes.
window,
Yes.
right? Like the way the sounds are working, right? That they're all piecing together.
No, you're right. And I mean, shame to interrupt that. Yeah.
I kind of hear that as you read it, Marian, as axes, like an axe, like beating down the wall or
Yeah.
climbing the frozen cliff to find your identity. And I think it works with the repetition there.
My Jersey accent.
Uh-oh. We're quieting down. We're all wanting to just hang out in the poem.
It's a great poem. I mean, yeah, like I want to just
Well,
hang out.
yeah. The whole series has just been what an experience.
It is really the way this poem is structured, or the series is structured. I keep calling it a poem because it does feel of a piece, but it's so novel. It's such an interesting and surprising structure for a poetic work. And I think that's part of what's making us want to dwell in it.
Don't you want to read the whole thing?
Again?
I
No,
can't
Let's
wait.
start
No, I
with
mean the
like
top.
read it from
whole
A to
thing.
Z. Like, don't you want you're like, wait, where's the book? Yeah.
Yep,
I want the
exactly.
book.
Exactly.
A to Z, the whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll want to read that. So it sounds like we should vote.
It sounds like it's voting time. Yeah.
Voting
All
time.
right.
And there's zero.
Zero dramatic tension, but here we go. 1, 2, 3. And it's in. Maggie Wolf, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Maggie Wolf. Maggie
This means
Wolf.
we have a total of 4 poems from this series, and we couldn't be happier about that. Thank you so much for sending your work to us in the first place, and then for allowing us to spend all this time with it on our podcast. Thank you. And I'm so glad so many people were here for the second part
Yes,
too,
I love it. Oh
And
my
we had
goodness.
very little trouble. We only had goodness. We only had Jason drop in, right? So
Yes.
no trouble
Nobody
this
got
time.
I took
raptured.
my helicopter and it was delayed over Johnson. So I didn't have to land upside down.
Oh, shh.
Oh,
know.
Lord.
Have
Wait,
you seen
did you
the
guys see my...
helicopters?
No, go ahead. What?
Have you seen the helicopters?
The helicopters that are now transporting people to the airport in New York?
Oh, I've read about it.
Yeah, my niece's husband is involved in getting that all legally signed off on, but
Mhm.
apparently there are testers operating, and it's going to be very inexpensive to helicopter out to the airport from New York proper.
Well, Billy Joel takes a helicopter from his Long Island estate to Madison Square Garden when he plays his shows.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Jason. I was wondering if anybody got my Billy Joel reference, right?
Well, I was gonna. It's funny when you brought it up, and then Kathy's like, "Wait," I was about to sing the song. I was about to explain Billy Joel.
I know by now.
Like, yeah, would not have been helpful. Yeah.
I think Billy just made it into the show notes.
Can we call it heart attack?
Yeah.
Please.
Thank you.
All right, guys.
Right.
Sorry. Say goodbye.
All right. Love you.
Thank you once again, Slushies, and to our team. And keep reading.
Yay!